bloodstains on the wooden planks, a family tragedy in the outskirts of Naples. On a sweltering morning in the suburbs of Naples, timber trucks lined up one after another in front of the depot. The driver, named Ricardo, long accustomed to the smell of pine, resin, and sawdust, suddenly frowned. Among dozens of tightly sealed wooden crates, one gave off a strange odor. It wasn't the scent of fresh wood, nor varnish, but a pungent, foul stenches, if death itself was seeping through a tiny crack. Ricardo shivered. He had worked this job for 10 years, but had never encountered a smell that twisted his stomach so violently. He called over his colleagues, and together they pried open the lid. The hammering of nails rang out sharply. The wooden lid burst open, and at that very moment, the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Inside lay the body of a middle-aged man bound tightly with rope, his limbs contorted, his face bluish, his eyes wide open as if trying to scream out something before death. His white shirt was soaked with sweat and dirt, his chin marked deeply by bruises. There was no doubt, this was no accident, but a violent death. The man imprisoned in the wooden crate like a lifeless commodity. Ricardo screamed, staggered back, his trembling hand pointing at the frozen corpse. The other workers dropped the planks they were carrying and stood paralyzed, as if turned to stone. One hurriedly dialed the police, his voice breaking. "There's a body in the crate. Please come immediately." Half an hour later, police cars screeched into the yard, sirens wailing. Blue uniforms, white gloves, and camera flashes flickered relentlessly. The body was pulled from the crate and laid on a white sheet amid the horrified whispers of the crowd. Someone whispered, "The dead man is Giovanni Bianchi." The news spread like wildfire. By noon, headlines had already covered the city's newsstands. Body in a wooden crate, crime hidden beneath the veneer of trade in Naples. The name Giovanni Bianchi was not unfamiliar. He was the owner of a small timber business, having risen from a family workshop. But in recent years, rumors spread that Giovanni was drowning in gambling debts, greedy enough to sell off even his ancestral land. Now, his death in a wooden crate, the very product tied to his life's work, was a cruel paradox dealt by fate. Naples was accustomed to street crimes, two gangs settling scores at night, but this scene was different. It happened in a small suburban town where everyone knew each other, where rumors spread faster than church bells. And now, with the crate forced open, the whole community was dragged into a family tragedy no one had foreseen. A young worker, trembling, told reporters, "We often delivered wood for the Bianchi family, but we never thought that one day the boss himself would be shipped off like a piece of cargo." That scene, gruesome yet grimly ironic, haunted everyone who witnessed it. A crate meant to hold wood or goods now held a human body. A businessman who once negotiated deals ended up packed inside the very product of his trade. To the police, this was not just a murder. It was also a warning. When greed and domestic violence accumulate, death can hide within the most familiar objects. And in Naples, the body in the crate case quickly became the center of attention, launching an investigation full of surprises. Once the body was identified, all eyes turned to the city police headquarters. The case was quickly assigned to Inspector Alessandro Romano, one of the sharpest figures in Naples' homicide division. At 45, Romano was no stranger to murders driven by money or family conflict. He was known for his ability to read psychology, and for a phrase his colleagues often quoted, "Money reveals a person's true nature faster than any confession." Romano entered the investigation with a calm face, his deep black eyes often unsettling suspects. He understood that Naples was a place where greed and family sometimes blended into the most dangerous mixture. The death of Giovanni Bianchi, bound inside a crate, could not be just a shady settling of scores. It was a tragedy rooted within his very own household. Giovanni Bianchi, 55 years old, was the victim. On the surface, he was the owner of a small timber business with a sawmill in the coastal town. He had once been respected for his hard work, but over time, the name Bianchi became tied to drinking bouts, all-night gambling, and debt collectors from everywhere. People said he was so greedy he didn't hesitate to sell even his ancestral land to pay debts, hiding his family in shame. In old photos that remained, Giovanni often stood with a half smile, a cigar in hand, the look of a man who valued money more than affection. Beside him was Maria Bianchi, his gentle and long-suffering wife. Throughout 30 years of marriage, Maria was known as a gentle, quiet woman, yet she was a frequent victim of her husband's rage. Neighbors often heard his shouting, even the sound of furniture breaking, while Maria quietly wiped away tears, stepping into the market the next morning as if nothing had happened. She lived trapped between fear and wifely duty, hoping only that one day the storm would pass. The third figure, and also the earliest focus of suspicion, was Marco Bianchi, the only son, 28 years old. He worked as a laborer in the family's sawmill, accustomed to the smell of sawdust and the stroke of the saw, but he could not bear his father's greed and brutality. Marco had openly quarreled with Giovanni over the division of property, especially after learning that his father had secretly sold his grandfather's land. In a fit of anger, Marco had even uttered the words the whole town remembered: "My father will die because of money." In a small suburban town near Naples, where everyone knew each other's business, the Bianchi family had long been the subject of gossip. Some pitied Maria, others felt sorry for Marco for having to live in the shadow of his authoritarian father. But all agreed that Giovanni was the embodiment of greed, a man who saw wealth as a weapon to impose, not as a foundation to build upon. On the first night of receiving the file, Romano sat alone in his office, spreading the crime scene photos before him. Giovanni lay contorted, his eyes wide open inside the crate. Romano tapped his pen softly against the desk. To him, this was not just a body. This was the result of a long chain of conflicts: a greedy father, a silent wife, an angry son. And to unravel this tragedy, he would have to peel away each layer of silence, each crack in the Bianchi family, like a carpenter splitting wood to reveal its core. Giovanni Bianchi's body was sent for examination the very day it was discovered. The preliminary forensic report sent to Inspector Romano confirmed what everyone had already sensed. Giovanni had died of strangulation, with deep bruises around his neck and clear finger marks on his bluish skin. The time of death was about 2 days before the body was found. This meant he had died while the crates were still in the family's workshop, before being transported like ordinary cargo. Romano and his team returned to Giovanni's old sawmill, amid the lingering smell of resin and the echo of saws. He noticed several dark stains seeping into the grain of the wooden floor in the workshop's corner. Upon closer inspection, it was blood, matching Giovanni's blood type. Right next to it lay a hastily discarded rope, thick, the very kind used to bind the body in the crate. Every small detail pointed straight toward the victim's own home, as if confirming that the crime had begun here. As Romano questioned the neighbors around town, the story gradually became clearer. An old woman living next to the sawmill said, "I heard them arguing all evening. Giovanni was shouting, and Marco's voice was just as furious. Then I heard something crash down. After that, silence. silence that felt unnatural. Another young man recalled, "The father and son argued about land, about money. Marco once shouted right in the street, 'You'll bury us all with your greed.' Everyone heard it." Those testimonies poured fuel onto the fire of suspicion. Marco, the only son, hot-tempered and notorious for it, had openly clashed with his father many times. He had once told his friends, "He'll die because of money." Now, with Giovanni truly lying dead in the crate, those words became indirect evidence whispered all over town. Romano did not rush to a conclusion. He knew that rumors could be exaggerated, but the traces in the workshop did not lie. A man strangled to death, hidden in a crate managed by his own family, and the son was the one with the most direct conflict. All of it formed a closed circle of suspicion. In the first interrogation, Romano looked straight at Marco. The 28-year-old son, broad-shouldered, with eyes darkened from sleeplessness. Marco claimed he had nothing to do with it, saying the last time he saw his father was when the man went out drinking. But his calloused hands trembled on the table, and his averted gaze convinced Romano that beneath the calm facade lay a hidden truth. "Do you know where your father would die?" Romano asked, his voice steady. Marco pressed his lips together, giving no reply. The interrogation ended there, but to Romano, the prime suspect had already taken shape. The case was no longer simply a body in a crate. It was a family tragedy where greed, debts, and quarrels piled up into a time bemand the sun might well have lit the fuse. Outside, the small town still buzzed with rumors. Everyone had a story to tell. Everyone had their own judgment. But in the police file, the name Marco Bianchi was already underlined like a red circle. Suspect number 1. In the days that followed, Inspector Romano did not rush to question Marco again. He knew the quickest way to untie the knot was not through emotional confessions, but through money. In nearly every case he had handled, the flow of money left clearer traces than any bloodstain. When the financial investigation team sent its report, the picture was even darker than anyone had imagined. Giovanni Bianchi, the man the small town still called the sawmill boss, was in truth nothing but an empty shell. He had secretly sold part of the ancestral land on the outskirts, a plot long regarded by the family as a treasure, the burial ground of Marco's grandfather. The money from the sale was funneled into shady accounts, then quickly vanished into gambling halls and underground debts. Romano reread the transfer papers, his finger tapping slowly on the desk. This was the detonator. For Marco, that land was not just property, but the pride of the family. Giovanni selling it without asking his son was like tearing apart the family's last shred of dignity. At the same time, another discovery from Marco's phone pushed suspicion entirely toward him. In his unsent message box was a shaky line, "Mother, I can't take it anymore. Father is destroying everything." The message was left unfinished, unsent, as if Marco had hesitated or been stopped. But to Romano, it was a key piece, proving that Marco's anger and resentment had reached their peak. When the police released these details, the town's public opinion exploded. Neighbors whispered that they had seen Marco growl at his father, that the son had once threatened to bury him alive for his greed. Though no one had witnessed the fatal moment, the financial truth drilled through the wall of lies. Giovanni had betrayed the entire family by selling the land, and if anyone had reason enough to explode with rage, it was Marco. In a second interrogation, Romano placed a copy of the land sale contract in front of Marco. The son stared at the paper, lips pressed tight, fists clenched. Veins bulged on his neck, his eyes flashing with both anger and resentment. Yet he forced himself to restrain. "I don't know anything about that." Romano did not reply. He simply pushed the phone toward him, the screen glowing with the unsent message. Marco bowed his head, silent for a long while. Not a word of defense, not a word of explanation. Only the sound of heavy breathing, like someone cornered against a wall. To Romano, that silence carried more weight than a confession. He knew that one who bottled things up too long would soon break. The only question was when. In his report to superiors, Romano wrote, "The direct cause of the case appears linked to financial disputes within the family. Giovanni Bianchi's illegal land sale triggered the conflict. All current evidence points to Marco Bianchi, the victim's son." Outside, the small town sank once more into murmurs. People no longer saw Marco as an innocent young worker, but as a man carrying a fuse of rage within him. And in their eyes, Giovanni's end in the crate was nothing less than the inevitable consequence of a family torn apart by money. Romano knew that to decode a family, nothing was more reliable than the people who lived within that house. So he turned to Maria, the quiet, long-suffering wife of 30 years. In the small kitchen, where light filtered through thin curtains, Maria sat with clenched hands, eyes red. She admitted that the night before Giovanni disappeared, the whole house had exploded in chaos. He was drunk, clutching a kitchen knife, shouting for money and demanding she sign mortgage papers. When she refused, Giovanni lunged at her, his eyes bloodshot. Marco rushed out from the next room. Maria recounted that father and son wrestled in the living room. Chairs crashed to the floor, the knife clanged against the chair, and then everything sank into a terrifying silence. She trembled as she said, "I was afraid. Afraid that if Marco hadn't arrived in time, perhaps I too would have died." But when Romano asked the final detail what happened afterward, she bowed her head and stayed silent. Perhaps fear and maternal love were tearing at her, keeping her from telling the whole truth. Those statements were reinforced by the neighbors. A middle-aged man insisted that on that night he heard a loud shout from the Bianchi house, "I won't let you destroy this family." The shout was believed to be Marco's. Right after, the whole neighborhood sank into silence, as if someone had switched off all sound in a theater. People believed that argument was the turning point, the moment everything collapsed. When the forensic team returned to the sawmill, tests confirmed that the tiny drops soaked into the floor belonged to Giovanni. There was no large pool of blood, but enough to confirm he had been injured right there. And the rope found near the blood matched perfectly the kind used to bind the body. All those cold pieces of evidence were like nails pinning the picture of the case in place. In his internal report, Romano wrote, "Maria's testimony shows the victim repeatedly threatened with a knife, sparking direct conflict. The neighbor's testimony confirmed Marco's presence at the scene and his violent reaction. The physical evidence, blood, rope, fit the hypothesis of a struggle leading to Giovanni's death. Public opinion in the town flared up like fire meeting wind. People gossiped in the cafe at the corner, in the small supermarket, in the parking lot. They pitied Maria, saying she had endured too much. They saw Marco as both to blame and to be pitied, a son driven to the edge. But no matter what was said, all agreed that Giovanni himself had sown the seeds of tragedy through his greed and tyranny. In his office, Romano lit a cigarette, thin smoke curling around his graying hair. He knew he was getting closer to the truth. Marco's wall of lies was already shaking. All that was missing was the moment he collapsed, admitting what had happened that fateful night. And Romano, with his experience, understood that collapse was only a matter of time. The interrogation room at the Naples police station was bathed in cold white light. Marco sat opposite Inspector Romano, his hands on the metal table, trembling uncontrollably. In front of him lay a thick stack of files, the forensic report, photos of the bloodstains in the workshop, the sealed length of rope, and statements from his mother and the neighbors. Each page was like a mirror, reflecting the moment Marco wanted to bury. Romano did not push. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed, his voice warm but firm. "You know what I have in my hands. What's missing is your account. And sometimes the truth frees you faster than lies do." Marco bit his lip until it bled. After a long moment he shut his eyes, then his voice broke, trembling as if smashing through the wall of repression he'd held for days. "I didn't intend to kill my father. I only wanted to protect my mother." He began to tell the story, his voice choked. That night, Giovanni came home drunk, a kitchen knife glinting under the yellow light. He shouted, forcing Maria to sign mortgage papers on the remaining house. When she resisted, Giovanni lunged at her, his voice rough with threats. Marco stepped out from the room and saw his father pressing the knife to his mother. Blood boiled in him. He rushed forward and grappled with him. Chairs crashed. The knife struck the floor. Screams echoed. In a fit of extreme rage, Marco strangled his father with hands calloused from woodwork. Giovanni's resistance weakened, his eyes bulged, then he went limp. When he realized his father had stopped breathing, Marco panicked, his heart racing as if about to explode. He could think of nothing but one frantic idea. Hide the body, at least so his mother would not have to witness this scene again. He dragged the body into the sawmill, his breath heavy, sweat mixed with salty tears. Looking around, his eyes fixed on the large wooden crates ready for shipment. In panic, Marco pried open a lid, stuffed his father's body inside, tied it tight as if it were just another shipment. He believed the smell of resin would cover everything, but the stench of death cannot be contained. 2 days later, the secret was exposed in the middle of the depot. When the confession ended, the entire room sank into silence. Marco bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. It was not the cry of a villain, but the sobs of a son driven to despair, losing control in a single moment. Romano sat motionless, but inside him a storm surged. This was not the first time he had heard a confession, but every family case left a wound that never fully healed. He understood clearly, Marco had committed the crime, but the root of it lay in Giovanni's greed and violence. The father, who valued money over blood, had sown the seeds of tragedy. News of the confession spread across Naples. The press seized the chance to highlight the tragic irony. A wooden crate, the source of the Bianchi family's livelihood, had become the coffin burying its tyrannical patriarch. That image was repeated in the newspapers, becoming the dark emblem of a collapsed family. In prison, Marco sat silent for hours, saying nothing. He knew the sentence awaited him, but perhaps deep inside, he felt relief at having freed his mother from years of horror. The tragedy was that this liberation would cost him the rest of his life. In his final report on the investigation, Romano wrote only one line. This was not just the death of a man, but the death of a family. The trial of Marco Bianchi drew the entire small town on the outskirts of Naples. People crowded into the courtroom, not only to see the face of the man who had killed his father, but also to witness firsthand a family tragedy everyone had heard about in whispers. On the benches, Maria sat quietly, her face gaunt, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She had lost her husband, and now was about to lose her only son. Marco entered, hands cuffed, thinner than before. The anger was gone, replaced only by weariness and submission. When the judge read the indictment, the room was so silent one could hear the rustle of paper turning. The charges rang out: murder in a fit of passion, disposal of the body, causing shock to the community. The defense attorney argued that Marco had acted to protect his mother in a sudden outburst after being threatened by his father with a knife. The panel of judges deliberated at length, for no one denied the violent background this family had endured. After hours of debate, the final verdict was announced: 18 years in prison for Marco Bianchi. The gavel struck, fate sealed. In that moment, Maria burst into tears, her thin shoulders trembling. She had endured for so many years, but in the end she still lost everything. A greedy, violent husband, dead in a wooden crate. A son who sought to protect his mother, now trapped in the clutches of the law. This tragedy was no longer the affair of one family, but a bitter lesson for the whole community. The small town was shaken. In the corner cafe, in the grocery store, at the market, people talked endlessly. Some felt pity for Marco, believing he was a victim of circumstance. Others were stern, saying the law could not forgive killing, no matter the reason. But all agreed on one point: Giovanni was the origin of the tragedy, with his bottomless greed and tyranny within his own home. Inspector Romano, in his final report, wrote a brief but haunting passage. Giovanni's death was not only because of one man's greed, but also because of the silence accumulated within the family. When money is placed above kinship, the wooden crate ceases to be cargo and becomes a coffin prepared in advance. Those lines were quickly quoted in the press as a bitter reminder. Many realized that in every household, if financial conflict, violence, and silence kept piling up, tragedy was only a matter of time. Naples returned to its daily rhythm, but the image of the body in the crate still haunted its people. It was not just a murder case, but a mirror reflecting families gradually breaking under money's strain. In a society where money rules too much, the Bianchi case became a story reminding people family bonds, if not preserved, can be buried as easily as logs in a workshop. And in prison, Marco Bianchi quietly counted the days. He had no father anymore, and no freedom either. Only the memory of that fateful night remained, when one strangling grip in fury had changed the fate of the entire family. This tragedy left a cold but undeniable message: financial conflicts in a family, if not resolved through dialogue and respect, will sooner or later lead to a death, whether of the body or the spirit.